All right, we continue to get reactions from people across the world, and being part of the Commonwealth meant that many young Africans could travel to the United Kingdom. At one point, I don't know what the situation is now, you could get a Commonwealth visa if you were under 25, and you could travel to the UK and work there for 2 years. And that was part of the whole Commonwealth project of giving and enabling young Africans to be able to travel and experience a life abroad. And the Commonwealth has its wings, many parts of the world, many countries in Africa, and one of them Zambia, of course. And we go there now to get some reaction from a former SABC and BBC senior journalist Maureen Nkandu. Maureen, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Good to have you on the programme.
Thank you. It's a sad evening, and thank you for having me on the show, Peter.
Yours is a personal story, isn't it, the passing of the Queen?
Oh, yes, this is very personal for me, and I'm actually very hurt, and obviously sincere condolences to everybody in the United Kingdom and in the Commonwealth. It's very personal because I did meet the Queen twice. I met her the first time when I was 12 years old as a young student in Lusaka, because I was selected to write a speech on behalf of all Commonwealth children, which was to be presented to the speech. And my speech at that time, 1979, was based on calling attention to the Commonwealth on what was happening in countries in Southern Africa, including Mozambique and Angola, the liberation struggle in that time. It was Southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, Southwest Africa, South Africa itself, and so on. So I met her because my speech was selected, and so she got to visit the school that I attended, which was the Lusaka Girls Primary School, which was a great honor for our school. And I presented my speech to her, and when I finished reading the speech, she asked me what I wanted to be. And I said to her, I wanted to be a broadcaster. And she said, so you shall be. And of course, then it was exciting. But the second time when I met the Queen, I was really excited. And that was during the Commonwealth Summit in Durban in 1999, which was 20 years after I had met her the first time. And so I was just chatting with some friends, my colleagues, Tracy Going, who was previously with the SABC, and just talking about how excited I was to hopefully meet her again for a second time, and recounted the first time that I met her. So word did get to her that amongst the audience that was to meet her was a lady whom she had met 20 years earlier at a particular school. And so when she walked into the ballroom, well, the holding room, before we walked into the reception where the ballroom was to take place, she walked right straight up to me because she had been told I'd be there. And she stretched out her hand, obviously with protocol. You don't greet the Queen until they stretch out their hand to you, and you don't speak until you're spoken to. And so with that etiquette, she stretched out her hand and greeted me. And I said, what a pleasure it was to see her again, because I did meet her before, unbeknown to me that she already had that background information. And her question was, did you ever become broadcaster? And I said, yes, Your Majesty, I did. And she said, very well done. And she walked on. And so for me, obviously, having met her at an early age, I've been a royalist, if you could say that, in the sense that I've followed very keenly what's happened with the royal family. And so this is a very personal tragedy to me and my family. Of course, my mother and father are not alive today, but they were there on that day when I did meet her.
There are some people who walk into a room and they just have an aura and something that just a presence. Is that something you experienced with her? Many people talk about her having this quiet power.
Oh, yes. I mean, it felt like it was very Blair in the room. It was almost like something that was so surreal. She was the Queen, and you would actually feel that that was a living Queen. you know, as children, we read a lot of stories, fairy tales about the princess and the queen and so on. But to meet a real queen and be in the same room with her was actually real, and one could feel it. There was a lot of attention to her. She was obviously very down to earth and very personable and likable and pleasant and got to smile. Of course, it was her duty as a queen to do that. But she had that aura, and of course, she had a lot of power. She had a lot of very silent power around her. And a lot of people actually listened to what she said. She was very well informed. She knew what was happening in the Commonwealth, obviously. And she said the most appropriate things at the appropriate times to the appropriate people when she did get to meet them. So she had a lot of power and presence, obviously, by virtue of her being one of the most, if not the most popular queen the world's ever experienced.
So, I mean, the meeting was short, it was brief, but I wonder, did you get a sense that her interaction was genuine, sincere, and deeply felt rather than just a duty?
Well, in my case, the first time when I met her, it was sincere because it was quite well, for the time that is given for one to meet Her Majesty the Queen or anyone from the royal family, it was quite long because my speech was about 3.5 minutes, and then I got to interact with her. So it was more or less about 5 minutes of interaction. And as a 12-year-old, it felt as absolutely genuine as it ought to be, and it's something that I cherished. When I met her the second time, it's only later that I found out that she had been briefed about me being in the room so that, you know, it would look quite courteous and also good that she did remember that she met me. So, of course, it came across as sincere, as very genuine, because that was part of her duty, that she had to make that connection with audiences and with the individuals that she met. And obviously, for anybody, it was just a feel-good factor that one had that opportunity. I think my encounter with her the second time must have been about just 45 seconds. But it was very well appreciated because she did make reference to the girls' school. You were the young girl who wanted to be a broadcaster. Did you ever become that? And well done. So obviously, that felt very good to me, and it felt very real.
It's a difficult time, particularly here on the continent, when we're spending a lot of time talking about the Queen of England. We have our own monarchies across the continent, and they're not as celebrated as the Queen. So what are your own personal thoughts about the celebration of her that we perhaps don't afford as much to our own monarchs on the continent?
That's a very important question, Peter, because personally, I advocate a lot of Pan-Africanism around the African narrative. Who are we? What is our identity? And what is the story that we tell about our heritage, about our monarchs? There's this popular narrative around Eswatini, for instance, the last absolute monarch or monarchy. Why do we say that? Whose narrative is that? That is a Western media terminology. I worked for the BBC, and so I'm very familiar with some of these terminologies. So I feel that we Africans have done ourselves a disservice by not owning the narrative and by not revering our own traditional monarchs, be they kingdoms or be they traditional leaders. And I think that it is important because through them we can actually tell the history and the important story and the strength of the African culture, our traditions and our heritage, just as well as it is told by the English, by the British, for instance, about their kings and queens. So I think that we can still take advantage, and particularly we, meaning us journalists, to start revisiting the narrative and how we tell our own story. Why is Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth so revered? Why is this one of the biggest stories of the century for us in journalism? It is because of the continuous narrative about who she was, what family she came from, what she represented. Of course, not just being a queen, but also being the head of the Commonwealth, which is now 56 countries, which is very important. But we should also be able to magnify the status of our own leaders, our own monarchs, our own traditional leaders, so that generations that come should continue with that narrative and also just respect it. I think we need to respect our background and our history as importantly as our friends in the West do.
The Queen was loved, perhaps less loved all over the world, but Zambia, and I remember KK had a relationship with the Queen as well. So how are Zambians today, do you think?
Well, yes, KK had a very special relationship. Remember the famous dance that he had again during the period of the Commonwealth Summit in 1979. It was quite a heated time at that time because KK had very strong opinions about what was happening in the frontline states in Southern Africa as far as the liberation struggle was concerned. And of course, former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was amongst the royal party or the visiting delegation that was part of the Commonwealth. So I think Queen Elizabeth played an important part in sort of smoothing that relationship and easing the tension that was there amongst African leaders and that back then looked at as the British monarch that, you know, was to a certain extent at that time, the policy of the UK towards apartheid and so on was quite controversial. In Zambia, there are mixed feelings. Of course, Zambia is a country of very young people. The average age is about 30, if not maybe 35 to a certain extent. That's about 70% of the population. A lot of them will have known of the Queen. Obviously, it's an information age. They're well connected. They're tuned in. They understand what's going on around the world. But I don't think there's that direct relationship as there would be amongst some of us who are much older in our 50s, 60s and 70s, who were born when Zambia got its independence or just after in 1964, who sort of had a stronger tie, a stronger understanding of the monarch and what it meant to our country. So amongst our more senior citizens, and by that I don't mean very elderly people, but my generation and older, of course, this is a very significant moment that is going to be remembered because of the experiences that we had. We may not have met her directly, a lot of us, but a lot of us in Zambia did relate to us. I remember seeing some Facebook comments today when I shared my post of people saying, oh, well, I do remember her when she came to this town and that town, and we stood in a long queue and waved flags at her and so on and so forth. So they do remember certain aspects and how significant and important she was to us, Zambia having been a British monarch, a British colony, sorry. But again, for the younger ones, and again, this takes me back to your earlier question, why is this significant? Why is this an important part of our history? I think that there isn't that direct relationship to her. She was elderly. There's that huge generational gap. And I think that people would rather much relate to the younger monarchs in Zambia who seem to be sort of in line with the trends and the news of the day.
Maureen Nkandu, pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much indeed for sharing your memories with us.
Thank you, Peter. It's always a pleasure.
All right, that's former SABC journalist and BBC journalist Maureen Nkandu, who met the Queen twice, 20 years apart. And the first time that she met her, spoke to the Queen and told her that she wanted to be a broadcaster. And she certainly went on to have a distinguished career as a broadcaster, both here on the continent and abroad.